In recent episodes here, I have reported on recent votes at the United Nations General Assembly, which show how the United States is the world's leading rogue regime. That is to say, it violates international law more than any other country on earth. And we see another example of this November 2022 with the preliminary report that was released from the top UN expert on sanctions. Her name is Alina Duhan, and she released a devastating report that shows how the US sanctions and also the European sanctions on Syria could be a crime against humanity. They have made life complete hell for millions of civilians in Syria, leading to over 90% of Syrians living in poverty, over 90% of Syrians suffering from food insecurity, leading to massive power blackouts and energy shortages across the country of Syria, leading to hospitals not having energy throughout the day, which is, of course, very dangerous for people who need to get treatment in a hospital, leading to 1/4 of children being out of school because their schools don't have resources and they don't have heating in the winter. I mean, the conditions that Syrians are suffering in because of illegal Western sanctions, it's just unfathomable. This is a complete crime. And we have a report from the top UN expert on sanctions saying very clearly that these Western sanctions on Syria are criminal, they violate international law, and are potentially a crime against humanity. I published a report about this over at multipolarista.com. I will link to it in the description below. And I highlighted some of the main points of this roughly 20-page preliminary report from the United Nations top expert on sanctions. Now, I'm going to look briefly at this report here. Now, this is the report at the official United Nations website. Specifically, it was released by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it was published on November 10th. And the title is UN Expert Calls for Lifting of Long-Lasting Unilateral Sanctions Suffocating Syrian People. So, no punches pulled, very honest. These illegal Western unilateral sanctions are suffocating the people of Syria. Now, this preliminary report was released by the United Nations Special Rapporteur. A special rapporteur means a top independent expert of the United Nations. And there are different special rapporteurs in different areas. Alina Duhan is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. A very long name. What that means is that she is the United Nations top expert on sanctions and how sanctions violate human rights. Just for people who don't know, in international law, sanctions are officially referred to as coercive measures. And coercive measures that are approved by the United Nations Security Council are technically legal, but unilateral coercive measures, that is unilateral sanctions, that are not approved by the United Nations Security Council are illegal, criminal, according to international law. And the vast majority of the sanctions that the United States and Europe have imposed on countries like Syria, China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, those sanctions are illegal according to international law. Now, before I go to the official report, which is very lengthy, I just want to highlight another report that was released in 2021 by the same top UN expert on sanctions, Alina Duhan. And this was about the illegal US sanctions and blockade against Venezuela. And you can find this at the website of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The headline is UN Human Rights Expert Urges to Lift Unilateral Sanctions Against Venezuela. It was another devastating report that revealed that the illegal US sanctions on Venezuela led the Bolivarian government, the leftist government of Venezuela, to be starved of 99% of state revenue because Venezuela for 100 years has been a petrostate in which the majority of the over 90% of its exports come from petroleum products. And because of the US blockade, Venezuela was unable to export those petroleum products, oil mainly, and that resulted in massive economic suffering. So the situation in Syria is quite similar. And the reason I wanted to highlight this before I go to the new report in Syria is because it shows the fact that these United Nations experts have repeatedly over many years called for the United States to lift its illegal criminal sanctions on multiple countries for 30 years in a row. Almost every single country on earth at the United Nations General Assembly has voted to condemn the illegal US blockade of Cuba, calling for the US to lift that illegal blockade. Every single year, over 96% of UN member states have repeated that for 30 years in a row. And the US rogue regime has refused to lift that illegal blockade of Cuba. And now we see examples of UN experts calling for Washington to lift, and Europe, Brussels, to lift their illegal sanctions on Syria and Venezuela and Iran, and they ignore them. These imperialist countries in the so-called West, they spit in the face of international law. They are the world's leading rogue regimes. The US claims that Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and the DPRK and Zimbabwe and Russia and China are so-called rogue regimes. But according to any consistent definition, looking at international law, no other countries on earth come close to violating international law as much as the United States. So now let's look at this report from the top UN expert on sanctions regarding Syria. The official name of this, as is common at the United Nations, these titles are very long and they're not very good at marketing. But this is the official title: Preliminary Findings of the Visit to the Syrian Arab Republic by the Special Rapporteur on the Negative Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures on the Enjoyment of Human Rights, Professor Dr. Alina Duhan. So for people who don't know, again, Alina Duhan is the top United Nations independent expert on sanctions. She's also a professor of international law. So she visited Syria from the end of October to November 10th. So for 12 days, she took a trip there. And this is her preliminary report. It's about 20 pages. In 2023, she will be sending to the United Nations her full report, which is probably going to be hundreds of pages long. So this is the only preliminary version of it. And she investigated the impact of sanctions on human rights in Syria. And she made it clear that she not only met with people from the government, because there's going to be so many propagandists who have spent a decade supporting the imperialist proxy war to destroy the country of Syria, backing Salafi jihadist extremists linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all those fascist groups, backed by the CIA. There are going to be all these propagandists saying, the Assad regime, the Assad regime, the Assad regime. Well, this UN expert not only met with members of the internationally recognized sovereign government of Syria, which sits at the United Nations and is recognized by international law, but she also made it clear that she met with representatives of civil society organizations, healthcare providers, financial institutions, humanitarian groups, businesses, academia, and religious institutions, so like Christian churches and Muslim mosques, right? She also met with UN entities that are working inside Syria. And she goes through in the report and she does a brief outline of the history of the Western sanctions that have been imposed on Syria. Let's keep in mind that back in 2011, the United States initiated a regime change war to try to destroy the state of Syria, just as it did in Libya in the same year in 2011. NATO destroyed the Libyan state. Libya was the most prosperous country in all of Africa, one of the largest continent on the planet in terms of landmass, over 1 billion people. The US destroyed, the US, Canada, France, Britain, NATO destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa, Libya, quite literally destroying the state. Still today, in 2022, there is no central state unifying Libya. It was destroyed by NATO. And after it was destroyed, Libya became the site for an open-air slave trade. There were open-air slave markets of sub-Saharan African refugees who were sold right out in the open. Human beings sold into slavery. That is the so-called freedom and democracy that Libya was given at the barrel of a gun, at the point of a missile, by NATO, which now claims to be supporting freedom and democracy in Ukraine. Well, we'll see the consequences there will probably be very similar to the consequences that the people of Libya suffered. And in the same year, in 2011, the U.S. initiated a regime change war to try to destroy the state of Syria. The CIA spent billions of dollars. This is an objective historical fact. It's been all acknowledged by mainstream corporate media outlets. The CIA spent $1 billion a year, at least that, on the books. We'll never know of all the off-the-book spending, which is probably significantly more, in order to fund, arm, and train Salafi jihadist extremist rebels, so-called moderate rebels, most of whom were allied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And they tried to overthrow the Syrian government. Hundreds of thousands of people died on both sides of this horrific war. And the US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, European countries, and Israel all teamed up to try to overthrow the Syrian government, which had the support of Iran, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance, and also Russia. So, after 10 years, the West was unable to destroy the Syrian state like they did in Libya. The U.S. government admitted that their allies and U.S. intelligence, obviously, although they didn't admit that part, but Joe Biden himself admitted that U.S. allies were supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian Al-Qaeda affiliate, which is the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate in human history. And John Kerry, former U.S. Secretary of State, admitted that the U.S. was allowing ISIS to march onto Damascus, the Syrian capital. And that is what pressured Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia to intervene, because ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these foreign-backed extremist fascist groups were doing cross-border attacks in Lebanon, in Iran, in Iraq as well, of course, because this war was in Iraq and in Syria. So anyway, this brings us to today. After failing militarily to destroy Syria, the US and Europe and their allies in West Asia began imposing murderous sanctions on Syria because they were unable to physically overthrow the government using violent force. So instead, they just waged economic war. We're talking about a medieval-style blockade. So now this brings us back to the report. And Alina Duhan, the UN top expert on sanctions, details the brief history of the sanctions imposed. So back in 2004, the United States had already imposed sanctions on Syria. This is 7 years before the war began. And of course, the propaganda narrative is that the Syrian government was murdering its people and the U.S. had to fund moderate rebels to overthrow the government, ignoring the fact that the U.S. was backing regime change operations and imposing sanctions on Syria for many years before the war began in 2011. Then in 2011, the U.S. expanded those sanctions even further. In 2012, the U.S. once again expanded sanctions. And finally, in 2019, Washington imposed a full-on economic blockade of Syria by passing something called the Caesar Act, which is based on this very shady U.S. intelligence-backed operative called Caesar. This is a fake name of the Syrian operative who never showed his face in the testimony he provided to the U.S. government. Very shady operative, clearly backed by the CIA. So what happened because of the Caesar sanctions? That means that authorized secondary sanctions against non-U.S. persons anywhere in the world who provide financial, material, or technological support to the Syrian government or engage in transactions with it, or who supply goods or services to Syria's military forces or the energy sector. These sanctions include blocking property and transactions, as well as travel bans. What this means is a full-on blockade, because in 2012, 11 and 12, the US began imposing sanctions on the Syrian government. But in 2019, the US imposed secondary sanctions on anyone around the world who does business with Syria. That's to say that, like the US blockade on Cuba, it doesn't just affect Cuba and the US. The Caesar Act doesn't just affect Syria and the US. No country on earth, no foreign business, no foreign company on earth can do business with Syria, or they will be risking the US imposing sanctions on them. That's what secondary sanctions mean. Sanctions would be on the country. Secondary sanctions are on any other foreign country or business that does business with the sanctioned country. The US also has secondary sanctions on Venezuela, on Iran. We're talking about blockades. These are medieval style blockades that prevent anyone around the world from doing business with these countries. It's completely criminal. And then the European Union obediently followed along, doing basically the exact same thing that the US did. And Britain did the same, and Canada, and Australia, and Switzerland. So there is your myth of Swiss independence, of Swiss neutrality. No, in Europe there is no neutrality. They're all part of this same imperialist bloc led by the United States in the capitalist world system. And even the Arab League, led by the Persian Gulf monarchies, they also suspended Syria's membership and imposed sanctions on Syria. So what has been the impact of these illegal Western unilateral sanctions against Syria? Well, before the war, the Western proxy war in Syria began in 2011. From 2000 until 2010, Syria's economic growth averaged more than 5% per year. It's a pretty good rate. So the point is that Syria had a very healthy economy and was growing before the Western war to destroy it in 2011 started. But because of this decade of brutal war, followed by the illegal sanctions, the Syrian economy, the entire size of the economy, that is the gross domestic product, the GDP, shrunk by more than 90%. So we're talking about an insanely massive economic war. Today, the Syrian economy is 1/10 of the size that it was a decade ago, according to this United Nations report here. After 2018, the Syrian economy showed some improvement with positive growth rates and rising macroeconomic indicators. So that means that most of the military war was already over. Syria had won. So that's when the US and Europe began imposing these brutal sanctions. I mean, there already were sanctions, but a whole new level of a full-on blockade. Like the US blockade of Cuba, like the US blockade of Venezuela, they imposed a blockade of Syria. And then, of course, even though the economy had been briefly recovering, it went into complete tailspin. Not only because of the sanctions, but as this UN Special Rapporteur points out, but also because of over-compliance and de-risking by foreign companies and financial institutions. That means that even if technically a part of the Syrian economy is not sanctioned, foreign countries and foreign businesses are over-compliant with the sanctions, and they're risk averse. They don't want to risk any sanctions. So that means that they'll just stop doing business with the entire country. That's exactly what happened in Venezuela. The Obama administration declared Venezuela ridiculously an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And that meant that the Obama administration began imposing more and more sanctions, starting in 2014, then 2015, 2016, going forward. And then the Trump administration expanded them more and more. And that meant that even if a certain sector of the Venezuelan economy technically was not targeted by sanctions, other countries refused to do business with Venezuela because they were afraid that the US, this crazy rogue regime that tries to sanction everyone on earth who disagrees with it, they were afraid of being hit by US sanctions. So they just stopped doing business with Venezuela. They stopped doing business with Syria. We're talking about medieval style blockades. And because the US has one of the largest economies on earth, because the US dominates the international financial system and the SWIFT system of financial transfers, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and if you wanted to buy oil or many products in international trade, you have to have dollars, which means you have to have access to the US-dominated financial system. countries are afraid of doing business with sanctioned countries like Venezuela or Iran or Cuba or Syria. So we have to understand that when we're talking about U.S. sanctions, we're not only talking about the official sanctions on paper. This UN expert is emphasizing that over-compliance is a big problem. And she pointed out that another factor is the Syrian state's inability to exploit its strategic national assets, natural and other economic resources. I'm going to come back to that in a second. She's referring to the U.S. military occupation of Syria's oil fields and the Western theft of the Syrian central bank's foreign exchange reserves, which were frozen by the so-called democratic West, these imperialist dictatorships in the U.S. and Europe that just steal the wealth. They steal the central bank reserves of foreign countries they don't like. They're pirates. They are literally, according to the definition of piracy, the U.S. and European imperialists are international pirates. So, this UN expert says in her report, the Syrian economy is hostage to a protracted economic crisis with growing inflation and frequent devaluations of the national currency, all of which have eroded to the level of total extinction the purchasing power of households, which find themselves in a prolonged state of survival mode. She's saying that the Western sanctions on Syria mean they have led to total extinction of the purchasing power of Syrians. Total extinction. They have no purchasing power. They have no wealth. Over 90% are in poverty. They're in a prolonged state of survival mode. She talks about the insane rates of hyperinflation in Syria. And what a coincidence. The vast majority of countries that suffer from hyperinflation, like Syria, Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, are all under U.S. sanctions. People talk about Venezuela and Zimbabwe having run out of control inflation because they're under blockades by Western imperialism. It's not because of socialism or because they're barbarians in the global south who don't know how to run an economy or something like that, these racist narratives. No, it's because they're under blockades. They're under sanctions by Western imperialism. And Syria is no exception to that. The UN expert writes that the illegal sanctions imposed have shattered the Syrian state's capability to respond to the needs of the population, particularly the most vulnerable. 90% of Syrians now live below the poverty line. Since 2019, prices increased more than 800%. 800% inflation. In the United States, there's been inflation of 7 or 8%, and people were losing their minds. Imagine 800% inflation caused by these illegal sanctions. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost. We're talking about Syrians being plunged into poverty and unemployment. And then, of course, you throw in the COVID-19 pandemic, which made things even worse. And she points out, this UN expert, the crisis is exacerbated by the country's financial isolation because these sanctions designated Syria's central bank and all public financial institutions, thus completely blocking transactions for imports and exports, including of food, medicine, spare parts, raw materials, and items necessary for the country's needs and economic recovery, and restraining foreign currency inflows. So once again, Syria cannot import food. It cannot import medicine. It can't import technology and machine parts that it doesn't have domestically. So if the hospital has a machine that breaks, the Syrian government cannot import the machine parts needed to fix those hospital machines, so people die. They can't import medicine. They can't import food, and people are going hungry. They can't import fuel, and the U.S. military is illegally occupying Syria's oil fields to prevent Syria from having oil, which means it doesn't have gasoline, which means trade can't happen, which means that public transportation can't happen because there's no gasoline. People have to wait for days in line to get a liter of gasoline. This is a criminal medieval-style blockade. This is the war that the US and Europe are still waging on Syria. The war didn't end. It has been a criminal imperialist war going on for over a decade. And it's not only a war on the so-called Assad regime. It is a war on the entire collective population of Syria. Millions of people are suffering. This is a medieval-style blockade. And as the UN Special Rapporteur said, it could be a crime against humanity. And I want to stress this point again. Still today, the majority, or at least the plurality, of international trade is done in the US dollar, including especially for certain commodities like oil. That is to say that if a country in the global south wants to import oil, or wants to buy certain technology, or buy certain medicines, they have to have access to foreign currencies, largely dollars or euros. And especially if there's a country with a situation of hyperinflation that can't export, that means its currency is valueless, has no value. It's lost all its value. And because it can't export because of the illegal criminal sanctions against it, it relies even more on imports unless it can produce everything that it needs domestically, and it can't do that. And that means that it has to have foreign exchange reserves. But the Central Bank of Syria's foreign exchange reserves were stolen. They were frozen and stolen by the US and European financial institutions, just like the imperialist pirates in the West stole the Venezuelan central bank's foreign exchange reserves and gold, the Iranian central bank's foreign exchange reserves, the Afghan central bank's foreign exchange reserves, the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves. They are pirates. They are criminals. They violate international law more than any other country on earth. They, according to any definition of the term, are rogue regimes. So, Syrians are living in a complete crisis. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this here because, again, this report is very long. But she talks about how, because of these sanctions, the water sector in Syria has been devastated. There are constant shortages of electricity and drinking water. Power outages are frequent. In some areas, there's only power for 2 to 4 hours per day. Imagine only having power for 2 hours per day. Meanwhile, hospitals only have power for 10 to 11 hours per day. So half the day hospitals don't have electricity. How can you operate on patients if you don't have electricity? Similarly with water. She said that there's often contaminated water because the infrastructure, the water cleaning infrastructure, has been destroyed by war and Western sanctions. And also by Turkey, by the way, a NATO member, Turkey, which is militarily occupying a huge part of northern Syrian territory in Idlib, in alliance with Al-Qaeda, with Jabhat al-Nusra. Meanwhile, this contaminated water led to a cholera outbreak. Cholera is a completely preventable disease. Drinking water reaches many households during only 1 or 2 hours every few days. So you only have water every few days and you have it for 1 hour. You have to fill all these tanks. And then if you want to drink the water, you have to, if you even have any, you have to boil it. In my experience in Venezuela, I experienced the same thing when I was living in Venezuela. Same exact thing. We're talking about a medieval-style blockade being waged by US imperialism. Meanwhile, Syria's oil production is less than 10% of pre-2010 levels. Why is that? Because the main oil fields are no longer under government control. That is to say, they are being illegally militarily occupied by the US in alliance with its Kurdish proxies, the so-called Rojava, so-called, anarchist libertarian socialist utopia in Rojava, which is a US-occupied colonial outpost that is being used to steal the oil of Syria to starve the government of oil and the revenue that it would need. That's great. That's your great anarchists for you, who call us tankies for opposing criminal Western imperialism and the crimes against humanity committed against independent sovereign nations like Syria that refuse to be colonized. And if you don't support the anarcho-imperialists who are militarily occupying Syria's oil fields, then you're a tanky. Well, there you go. That's what tanky means. You don't support U.S. imperialism and its proxies. Similarly, because oil products are under sanctions, Syria can't import oil. That means that there's shortages for heating, transport, and industry. And public transportation is completely destroyed because there's no gasoline and because Syria can't import the machine parts that it needs to replace the broken vehicles, the broken buses and planes. In the health sector, this UN expert talks about how the health sector has been devastated. Disruptions of power in hospitals are frequent. This impacts medical operations and the functioning of medical equipment with serious consequences for patients. A report by experts at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, one of the only good think tanks in Washington, D.C., reported that because of the illegal U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, tens of thousands of Venezuelans died, civilians died, because they couldn't get medical treatment and medicine that they needed. It's the same in Syria. Thousands of Syrians are dying because they can't get medical treatment because of the illegal Western criminal sanctions against them. She talks about how also the irregularity of electric power has led to overloads with destructive effects on sensitive and expensive medical equipment. Anyone who spent a lot of time in the Global South knows that if you have an electrical grid that is sometimes unstable, you have to buy these things. Like I have this little block here. You have these little block things that you plug everything into, and they stabilize the energy. Because if you have the energy go out, even if it goes out for like 1 second, sometimes, if you're in Latin America, in most countries, sometimes the power will go out for like, 5 seconds or a minute or whatever. And what that means is that even though you might get the power back soon, you're not stuck in the dark, it could actually fry your electrical equipment. Because when you have like these shortages that go out, it short circuits and it destroys your computer or your TV or your microwave or your fridge. These are expensive appliances, especially for people who make much less than workers in the Imperial Corps. So what she's saying in this report here is that because not only, even when they do have power, because disruptions are frequent because of these sanctions, that means that very expensive and sensitive medical equipment is destroyed. And then Syria can't import the new parts they need to fix that equipment, or they can't import the new equipment itself. So we're talking about, once again, people dying because they can't get medical equipment and medicine. Meanwhile, 14.6% of Syrians suffer from chronic and rare diseases, and 24% of Syrians are disabled. This war, this Western proxy war to try to destroy Syria, has devastated the country so much that 1/4 of all Syrians are disabled and 15% suffer from chronic disease. This is just so criminal. I mean, how can you not read this and just be so infuriated by these crimes against humanity being committed by the Western imperialist powers? By the way, this is the so-called rules-based international order that the U.S. State Department loves to talk about. This is their beloved rules-based order. They wage economic war against any independent country, killing and torturing millions of civilians, collectively punishing them. And then when the United Nations criticize these Western imperialist powers, they ignore the United Nations because they're rogue regimes. They don't care about international law. That's why they're trying to replace the international law-based order centered on the United Nations with the so-called international rules-based order in which the United States makes the rules and orders everyone around. And here, the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions points out, this is a very important point, the West constantly says, our sanctions have exemptions. They have exemptions for medical equipment and for food and medicine. But she points out that although medicines and medical devices are technically not subject to sanctions, the vagueness and complexity of the licensing processes, The persistent fear among producers and suppliers, the restrictions in the processing of payments, and the obstacles to shipping these goods have made them inaccessible to the Syrian public. That is to say, once again, over-compliance and secondary sanctions make it basically impossible for Syria to import food, medicine, and medical equipment, despite the fact that the U.S. claims they have humanitarian exemptions. That doesn't mean anything. It's propaganda. It's PR. It doesn't mean anything. This is what sanctions do always and everywhere they're imposed. And here in her report, the UN Special Rapporteur talks about food security. Syria is facing a serious food crisis. 12 million Syrians, more than half the population, are grappling with food insecurity. So actually, a slight correction. Earlier I said over 90% of Syrians are food insecure. What I meant is over 90% of Syrians are in poverty. Over half of Syrians are food insecure. So a slight correction what I said earlier there. Over half of Syrians are suffering from food insecurity. 2 million are severely food insecure. And again, this report goes on and on and on. I'm going to fast forward here toward the end, just so I can start wrapping up. Here are the conclusions from the UN top expert on sanctions, Elena Duhan. She said, unilateral sanctions, secondary sanctions, threats of sanctions, de-risking policies, and over-compliance with sanctions have been exacerbating Syria's humanitarian crisis, which is already affected by 12 years of conflict and terrorist activity, destruction of infrastructure, COVID-19, a growing economic crisis in the region, and millions of internally displaced people and refugees. By the way, when she says terrorist activity, of course, what she didn't mention is that terrorist activity was backed by the CIA and by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey and Israel and Europe. She says Syria's desperate humanitarian situation and the huge negative effect of unilateral sanctions. She said, she says here that I note with regret that despite multiple reports by UN organs and international and national NGOs on Syria's desperate humanitarian situation and the huge negative impact of unilateral sanctions, these reports and calls have not been heeded. That is to say, that the Western imperialist powers have ignored constant reports by the UN and constant calls that they lift their illegal sanctions. And here, I'm not going to read this all, it's very long, but she talks about the insane blockade against Syria and every aspect of its society. And she says, these sanctions have had a devastating impact on the whole population and on the functioning of civil society. These sanctions have a devastating effect on nearly all categories of human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, the rights to health, to food, to adequate housing, to an adequate standard of living, to clean water and sanitation, to a favorable environment, to access to internet, and to life. The whole population stays in life-threatening conditions. Not just the so-called Assad regime. We're not talking about just Bashar al-Assad and his ministers. The whole population stays in life-threatening conditions with severe shortages of drinking water, water for irrigation, sewage facilities, electricity, fuel for cooking, heating, transportation and agriculture, food, including baby formula, health facilities, medical equipment and medicine, work and education facilities, making the country extremely vulnerable. This is the barbaric blockade that the people of Syria are subjected to by Western imperialism. There is no defense of this. I am reading a report from the United Nations top expert on sanctions. This is not from the Syrian government. This is not from, Al-Mayadeen, a pro-resistance media outlet. This is not from, a communist party media outlet. This is from the United Nations. It's as mainstream as it gets. Of course, you're not going to see this report mentioned in Western corporate media, which ignores the United Nations whenever it criticizes U.S. imperialism and only talks about the United Nations when it criticizes Russia or any of the other U.S. boogeymen. Here she points out that even the efforts of UN agencies and international humanitarian groups, even their projects are hurt by the Western sanctions because they can't do bank transfers. It's very difficult for them to deliver humanitarian aid because of over-compliance among banks and shippers and insurers, because of the very lengthy, complicated, and bureaucratic process, forcing humanitarian actors to seek alternatives and putting the burden on them. So these Western sanctions that are illegal on Syria are also hurting the United Nations itself and hurting humanitarian organizations. The U.S. loves to talk about human rights groups and NGOs. Well, the U.S. is preventing them from doing work in Syria. And finally here, she says, this is the last thing I'll end with, maintaining unilateral sanctions amid the current catastrophic and still deteriorating situation in Syria may amount to crimes against humanity against all Syrian people. This is the top UN expert in sanctions saying very clearly these Western sanctions on Syria could be crimes against humanity. She says, I call on sanctioning states to lift all unilateral sanctions applied to Syria. She notes that they do not have the authorization of the UN Security Council and therefore cannot be justified in accordance with international law. She also once again emphasizes the illegality of the extraterritorial application of unilateral sanctions. This is her once again calling for the lifting of these illegal sanctions and emphasizing that they are illegal. They violate international law and they may amount to a crime against humanity. So whenever you hear the US or Europe talk about the so-called rules-based order or the international community or even international law or human rights, they are the leading rogue regimes. The Western imperialist powers violate international law more than any other country on earth. They violate human rights more than any other country on earth. They are suffocating entire countries. They are collectively punishing tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, with their illegal wars and sanctions and regime change operations and meddling. And even the United Nations has repeatedly spoken out about this. And unfortunately, it's ignored in Western media. That's why I thought it was important to spend so much time today going through this report, which you're not going to see on CNN, on Fox News, on MSNBC, in the New York Times, and Washington Post. So, if you want to support the work that I do, you can go to patreon.com/multipolarista. I have no big backers, no sponsors. I'm completely independent. The only revenue I have is from people who support my independent journalism. And if you want to find the sources, the links to all sources that I mentioned in this analysis, in the description below, I have a link to the article, which has everything in there. I'm Ben Norton. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and I'll see you all next time.